Yeah, my purpose here is to tell you about some of the research we've been doing and share with you where we think we're gonna take some of that research. So I definitely want some feedback from you guys. I'm a soil scientist. I know a fair amount about what happens in soil, but I'm not a potato producer. I don't grow potato crops. So I come up with some pretty zany ideas about how I think nitrogen should be managed. And we do some work on that in our lab, and we publish some papers. But ultimately, for what I do to be of any value, it has to be in a form that you're going to use and is of value to you. And so as we roll out these ideas, as we develop these things, I really need your feedback as to, am I barking up the right tree here, or am I, why am I missing the mark? And what I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about today is about right rate. I've convinced myself, rightly or wrongly, that I think we're probably putting a little bit too much nitrogen on potatoes in Prince Edward Island. You may or may not agree with me. In fact, I hope we're going to talk about that. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tools that I think can allow us to both assess that and also maybe determine more empirically or more data-driven what the right rate might be. This is work that we've been doing over the last decade and a half in the Atlantic region in collaboration with a whole bunch of people. Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Bernie Zebarth in Fredericton, Judith Niraniza here in Charlottetown, the PEI Department of Agriculture, Danny, Kyra, Barry, Thompson, Ryan for the Potato Board, Fertilizer Canada, and Steve Watts. Also the East Prince, Kensington North and Surrey's watershed groups. This has been a really effective and useful group to work with because it's got growers, it's got government people, it's got agronomists, it has research scientists all sort of trying to noodle around with this issue. And so what I'm presenting is my take on this, but it's not the result of work that's been solely my doing, a collaborative effort. So I want to talk about nutrient management. And nutrient management being the goal being to produce a crop, but do it in a way that is environmentally benign. Our classical concept of soil fertility that developed in the 30s, 40s, and 50s of the last century was very much driven around what is it we need to do to supply the plant with all the nutrients it needs. So how can we remove any nutrient limitations? And the focus was on the plant, solely on the plant. And that was the science of soil fertility. A lot of chemical analysis of soils, a lot of development of soil testing tools, fertilizer response tools, those sorts of things. In the 70s, we started to realize that as a result of crop production, intensive crop production, we were starting to have some environmental impacts. And in particular, because of the use of animal manures. The intensification of the animal production industry and the separation of that animal production industry from feed production resulted in a lot of distribution issues with manure and a lot of excessive applications of manure. And particularly in the US, nutrient management regulations became enacted. And the whole concept of nutrient management was primarily about manure management and siting of intensive animal feeding operations. But it also introduces the concept that not only should we be thinking about taking care of that plant, but we've also got to think about, in doing so, are we having adverse effects on soil, air, or water? And that's the concept of nutrient management. And Fertilizer Canada came up with this concept of 4R nutrient management, right rate, right place, right source, right time. And this concept that not only does it address the issues of the economic issues of the producer about producing a cost-effective yield, making a profit, but also this environmental issue and social issues associated with the sustainability of that food production system. One of the things that I like about the premise of 4R is it acknowledges the fact that if we're going to do this right, we have to have good, strong science to back these practices, to support that this practice is going to achieve this goal or going to do this. It tries to take science from the lab bench and put it into practice. And quite frankly, over the last number of decades, science hasn't necessarily been challenged enough to do that. Too often, I'm an academic. In my university life, I'm asked how many papers I've published, period. And you can get comfy in those chairs. And this challenges us a little bit more to say, you not only have to do science, but you have to apply it. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. But we're also now just been introduced with another new term, soil health. And so that says, yeah, you got to produce a crop economically. Yeah, you got to make sure you don't impact the environment adversely. But let's also talk about the sustainability of your system. Let's talk about, are the practices you're using, are they going to allow us to sustain that system in the longer term? And we're going to focus on some of the larger roles that soil plays, not only in crop production, but also in other aspects of our environment. So we're going to talk about the role of soils in maintaining safe water. We're going to talk about it as a habitat for organisms. We're going to talk about it as a storage source for water, so that in situations of extreme climate, it both can drain water efficiently and effectively, but can also store water to withstand drought. There's a whole variety of aspects of soil health that we want to make sure that we're sustaining. This has given rise to an initiative that we received funding for a couple of years ago through Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Initiative to establish an Atlantic Soil Health Lab. And we've been working with Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia to start to get an initial baseline data on what are some of the measures we might use to assess soil health. We've started with a framework that Cornell University has developed called the Cornell Soil Health Assessment Framework, and we're collecting some baseline data for PEI in Nova Scotia primarily, now New Brunswick, to say, how do we actually measure soil health? And is soil health a useful measurement in helping you make management decisions? How can that information be useful to you? We're not just going out to measure stuff for the sake of measuring stuff. We're asking, is it actually useful in telling us where our soil function is our soils aren't functioning the way we need them to. Today I want to focus primarily on the issue of determining the right rate of nitrogen fertilizer. So I'm only going to be really talking about nitrogen. I am going to talk about all 4 R's, but I'm going to focus primarily on right rate because it's the one that's been bugging me the most. The one I really struggle with trying to understand how we determine right rate and how we assess whether that is indeed the right rate or not. And can we provide tools that will allow you to better determine right rate for your farm? A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is based on an effort that happened about a decade ago under another greenhouse gas program, which funded various soil and crop improvement associations to form taking charge teams. And this was a product of the New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island taking charge team at the time, where we said, let's try to formalize how one should make a nitrogen management recommendation for potatoes. And so we're going to go through some of that same material. This is the original fact sheet that was produced. There's a slightly updated version of that on the PEI government website that's accessible. And we'll be talking about some of the tables in that system as just sort of a structural framework to talk about the various components that go into the determination of the right rate of nitrogen fertilizer. And again, so that's my theoretical approach to it. As a soil scientist, as an agronomist, that seems like the right way. But I also want your feedback as to what I'm missing on this. As farmers, what doesn't ring true? What's nonsense? Because I'm going to say some nonsense up here, and I don't know what's nonsense. You need to tell me it's nonsense. The other thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is some of the tools we're trying to develop to be more specific, be more measurement based. One of my real worries is that we do a lot of stuff from general tables. tables that are for all of Prince Edward Island, for all of Atlantic Canada, that don't reflect the fact that your farm is very different, your management practices, your fertility regimes are different from farm to farm, probably from field to field, and probably even within a field, but I'm not going to go to that level of detail at this point. So I'm a firm believer that we don't spend enough time measuring the soil and saying, how you doing? What's your potential? What are your problems? And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So one of the things we've been trying to develop is a nitrogen test that measures the biological nitrogen supplying capacity of the soil. We place that in the context of the climate of the province. It could be more specific climate data. We don't currently have that, but it could be. To predict how much mineralization is going to occur. So we wanted to ask the question, can we do that? And secondly, is there significant variation from farm to farm in nitrogen mineralization potential that it's worth measuring? Maybe the assumption that the province is all basically the same, 30, is pretty good, or not. Maybe there are specific differences that are worth considering. So that's one thing I'm going to talk about. I'm going to later talk a little bit more about end product measures. We're all familiar with crop yield. That's a very major determinant of the success of the year. But increasingly, we're going to be asked to look at residual soil nitrogen. And I'm going to talk about that as a fall. That's the amount of nitrate that's left in your field after harvest in the fall. I'm going to talk a little bit about the measurement of that and whether that's going to tell us something about nitrogen use efficiency. That's going to be one of the major themes I want to get across is we need to be assessing the efficiency of our nitrogen use for both agronomic reasons but also for environmental reasons. Questions about that? Okay, so these are basically the things I'm going to talk about, calculating the end requirement. I'm going to mention briefly manure, but we're not going to spend much time on manure. Credit for the previous crop, credit for soil organic matter, how do you make a fertilizer recommendation, and then how might we adjust that for our practices. So theoretically, this is Stanford basically said here are the elements that you should be considering in determining the nitrogen rate for a particular crop. What's the crop? What's the variety? How much nitrogen does it need? Is that based on a realistic yield goal? Are you fertilizing for potatoes you're not going to get? So how much nitrogen does that plant need? Is yield the only factor in your nitrogen rate recommendation? And because a lot of the things I'm hearing as I talk to producers is, oh, well, we add more nitrogen to deal with the verticillium. We add more, what about the, there's other elements that I may not be considering in this simple stoichiometric or mass-based consideration. So I want to hear about that. Okay. The other thing is we have to account for all sources of nitrogen. And that's where I think we're not doing a very effective job. We hope to give you tools that will allow you to do a better job of that. And then also, what's the efficiency of end delivery? Are we actually assessing how efficient our nitrogen use is and trying to improve that? So let's start. So this is a table of base values, and I'll go through the actual calculation or how we use these base values in a second, but these are the base values that reflect the variation in the nitrogen demands of various potato varieties. And I'm very interested to know what you think about these. This is available on the provincial government website as part of their document. I forget what the document's actually called. I think it's just called nutrient management or something.
Yeah. There's one bill out specifically, nutrient recommendations for crops.
Yeah.
So this is current PEI recommendations? Roughly current-ish?
Yep. Yep. So there's a couple of things I want to sort of discuss about this with you guys. So, do these numbers kind of look right? Do you use these numbers? If not, why not? And do you know where these numbers come from? Like, how do we come up with these numbers?
I think, Dave, some of the uncertainty of credits that we're dealing with makes us a little uncertain as to where that number needs to get to. Are we hitting the credits on the mark, and do we have enough information? I know you're talking about a nitrogen test, which is kind of coming upstream, but that makes it hard to say, are those the numbers that we use?
So these are the base numbers. We're going to do a legume credit, we're going to do a soil organic matter credit, we're going to do a manure credit. So we're going to go there. So that's a very good conversation, but let's park that one for now. Base value. Say there's no previous crop credit at the moment, no manure application, forget the organic matter. Are these the numbers you think a potato crop needs? So anyone has a hard time with these? Everyone say, oh, well, that's good. That's about what we're doing. Or is everyone saying, well, no, I go a bit higher?
How much rain are you getting?
So that's a good point. How much rain? I can't guarantee. I don't know how much rain are we going to get next summer. Did anyone find that out yet? Got that data? So that's a good point. It depends. So are you going to fertilize for what you've been getting over the last 5 years? Or are you going to fertilize for what you hope to get next year?
Hope to.
Hope to. So some people are saying hope to. Some people say, well, no, I use my average yield. We had a couple people last session.
So are you suggesting that you can fertilize for lack of rainfall?
Okay. First of all, at this point, I'm not suggesting it, but what I'm saying is, I understand why you fertilize for the yield you hope to get, and I understand economically why that makes sense.
You said weather though, not yield. In some of the years that the weather hasn't been necessarily cooperative, you can still, due to other factors, obtain a higher than expected yield.
Or a lower than expected yield.
That's correct. But I would still maintain the same baseline of fertility belief, like requirement belief,
Okay.
regardless of those conditions. You know you're not going to necessarily access and use it, but you got to pick a starting point somewhere.
Okay. 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 That's fair, and I think that's a fairly common approach. And so you're being optimistic in your fertilization in hopes that you're not going to have issues with weather, disease, whatever, another nutrient.
If it's as dry as it's been the past 5 years, typically you don't get the solubility to have the uptake anyways. There's usually residual granules, not necessarily of nitrogen, I guess, but left at harvest time anyways.
So, as a bit of a skeptic, I might say, then why are you putting it on if you know it's not getting used?
Because next year's going to be better.
Okay. Well, know what? Let's get that out there, because I think that is a dominant philosophy.
One of the challenges too, Dave, is the sources of nitrogen we're using. Like, they're predominantly, for the most part, they're all up front at planting, shortly after planting. We don't fertigate here. You know, we don't have the luxury of what other areas can do, where they can snap some product in the fertigation machine when they're running the pivot and maintain that desired nitrogen level in the crop.
So
Dryland agriculture adds a lot more complexity to a nutrition system than does the irrigating system.
Right, right. And so because we're making that decision early, we're having to gamble big rather than say, oh, by the way, we know we had a crappy spring, and therefore we have to respond to that.
Well,
Whatever.
and theoretically, you should be able to try to use the length of the growing season, but there's no new normal anymore, right? But if you're planting Burbanks the 10th of June, you should be thinking a little different nitrogen than if you're planting the 20th of May.
Right, right.
And I think some people do that. I don't know if everyone does it. But.
So how you interpret these numbers are going to be a little bit based on your factors. Okay, that's fair. But we should also ask where these numbers came from. So traditionally, where these sorts of numbers come from are nitrogen response trials. So basically, these response trials, what they would do is they would pick a number of sites. They would take a soil test, add various rates of fertilizer, see what the yield response curve was for that fertilizer, and then find out where the economic optimum rate is. So $1 more fertilizer generates $1 more yield, no more, or no less. And that would be the basis of a economically optimum response trial, a response. And so a lot of that data went into determining these numbers for various varieties. Potatoes are a bit in a fortunate situation in that at least the industry is continuing to do those kinds of response trials. Many other crops, they haven't been done for years. And for some varieties, they haven't been done for years. So that's a challenge, is how current is that data? Does it reflect current environment, climate? Does it reflect current management practices, current varieties? Because even on this table, you're going to say, oh, we don't grow that anymore, and where's such and such? That's one of the ones where they're not necessarily current. So that's a little bit of a challenge as to whether that generalized, and also I guess the other problem with many of these fertility response trials are, oftentimes they used to be done on government research stations, whether provincial, federal, or state. Those research stations were almost invariably chosen way back when, and they chose them saying, wow, that's a nice piece of land. Let's build a research station on that. Let's do all our fertility trials on that research station on nice little small plots where we control everything. So we'll have good low variability so we can publish a paper. And then, once we've optimized everything, let's extend that data to the countryside where there's all kinds of other variables that we haven't considered and assume that that number's good enough. And it isn't. And that's one of the flaws with this kind of data, is that it's very much dependent on the quality of the response trials, how recently they've been done, were they done on relevant management practices, were they done on soils that were relevant to the soils you're managing. So now there's a much more of a move away from that, saying, you know what, maybe it's better if we provide a way in which you can calibrate yourself, your own farm, your own management practices, your own varieties, so you don't have to rely upon this maybe sort of kind of and we can actually get a better base number before we start talking about credits that allows us to ensure that we're starting with the right number. So having said that, let's look at the kinds of things that are also recommended in this process. Is we start with that table 1 base number depending on the variety, but then we actually modify it a little bit for the length of season. Is this an early harvested or seed crop? If so, maybe we should drop it by 10% because it's not growing for quite as long. Maybe we didn't get it in quite as early. Maybe if we won't subtract anything if we get it in before May 25th, but if we put it in between May 26th and June 1st, we're going to take away 11 kilograms of N per hectare, 22 kilograms of hectare subtracted if we plant it between June 2nd and June 8th, and after June 9th, we're going to subtract 33 kilograms of N per hectare. This is a very relevant question for last year because there was a lot of late crops going in last year. Is this something you guys would do? Modify your N rate if you're planting it a little later?
Yeah.
Yeah,
A lot of people do that?
not to those numbers probably, but some.
Not as much as that?
No.
Okay. Okay. Simple math then. You do the math, you get your N rate. One of the elements that Stanford also talked about is determining a realistic number. Realistic is a very important word here. What is your reality? My reality is I'm optimist. I'm going to fertilize for the crop I want to get. Another approach is I'm going to be a realist in that I'm going to say, what have I done in the past? I'm not going to fertilize for a crop I'm not going to get or haven't been able to get. But how do you determine how much for a particular unit of crop? Well, I'm going to explore with you going to show you a calculator that the International Plant Nutrient Institute developed when they existed. They recently ceased to exist, so we're not sure what's going to happen with that. But they've got this handy little app. You can get it on your iPhone, your Android. You can type in any crop, any yield goal, and it'll say, here's how much nutrient it removes in the harvested portion. So for potato tuber, if we have a 350 hundredweight yield goal, it says we're taking off about 105 pounds of nitrogen per acre in tubers. And I think this is total yield. So we can do a quick little nitrogen balance. We put 185 on according to table 1. We removed 105 in terms of tubers. That means we left 75 in the field somewhere. Maybe it's in stems and plant tissue. Maybe it's in soil organic matter. Maybe it's in nitrate in the soil profile. So basically we got about a 58% nitrogen use efficiency. That's actually really good. In the nitrogen world, nitrogen use efficiencies approaching 60% are pretty high. We very seldom get too much above 60% unless we start using some of the higher efficiency fertilizers. But that's assuming we got that 200 or 350 hundredweight. If we look at the average potato yield in Prince Edward Island over the last 20 years, we haven't on average gotten that 350. We're closer to 300. So let's do that calculation again with 300 hundredweight. We're still putting 185 on. We only took 90 off instead of 105. That means we left 95 in the field. Now we dropped below 50%. Now we're only getting 49% use efficiency. Okay, so we're not being quite as efficient. We're not being quite as economic. The other aspect of this is we have to consider all the various end sources that contribute to nitrogen uptake. Only about half the nitrogen that's taken up by potato crop actually came from fertilizer. A bunch of it came from soil, from soil organic matter. So we can open up this nitrogen budget a bit by saying, okay, we're putting 185 of nitrogen on. Let's say for now we put 60 kilograms of N on, or as 60 kilograms of N is supplied as nitrogen mineralization. And I'll explain where I got that number a little bit later. We're still removing 90, and we also tied up 90 in the roots and residue. That's not going to be removed from the field, but it was tied up. That means our N balance now is 115 unaccounted for, and our nitrogen use efficiency is only 37%. Not doing that. So there was an opportunity to consider this number in choosing this number to try to increase our nitrogen use efficiency and decrease what was left in the field. And that's one of the things that I want to try to explore with you. That's one of the things we're trying to do by doing this. We're trying to give you a way of quantifying this number, so you can consider it in determining that number.
There's two things missing off the list: the cost of fertilizer and the value of the crop.
True. That's an excellent point. So these numbers don't consider either of those things. They're saying it's 180, it's been 180 for the last 10 years. Well, the cost of fertilizers changed, the value of the crops changed. So that's a very good point. So in doing these end response trials, once we get the curve, we know how the plant's going to respond to nutrient addition, but we don't know where the economic optimum is, because what determines that slope is the relative cost of inputs and outputs. That's a very good point. I'm not talking about that today, unfortunately, but it is an excellent point. What I'm suggesting would also come into that equation, though. And the final number will be determined by that. Oops.
Are those both gross numbers though, or are one of them pay and one of them gross?
These are both gross, I think. We're still talking
That
gross.
chart year over year is,
Those aren't crop insurance numbers, are they?
No, that's the Stats Canada number. For
These are total. These are not
That's
market.
total yield Stats Canada numbers.
total,
Yeah.
that's gross. Okay.
All varieties,
All varieties, all
Yeah.
purpose.
not just processing or just specialty.
Right on, right on.
So your comment as to how much we need will influence this number. but we still, I'm trying to argue that in determining how we supply that nitrogen, so it'll determine the total amount needed, but how much is supplied by soil versus fertilizer will still be a relevant discussion. So, one of the reasons why I'm of the belief that perhaps we're applying more nitrogen than we need to is some of the kinds of response trials we've been doing over the last number of years. So here's a response trial we did in 2017. The project I'm involved in is based on, is an attempt to assess whether there are nitrogen management strategies we can use to reduce nitrous oxide emissions. I know nitrous oxide emissions aren't a major determinant of your nutrient management planning strategy at the moment, but there's a number of government programs and whatnot that may try to encourage you to think more about greenhouse gas reduction. So in this trial, and we've done this for 2 years now, and we're going to do more of these trials in the future. What we did is on grower fields, so not in Harrington or not in the research station, but in grower fields, what we tried to do is create a number of sites, a number of replicated plots where we add various rates of nitrogen. In this case, 4 rates. 90 kilograms of N per hectare, 150, 210, and 260. And say, can we detect a change in yield as a result of those rates of nitrogen? In this year, we didn't, in this site. And that's because this was 2 years ago. In August, we had no water. So the crop basically died. So, yeah, it's wasted a lot of effort. Shame that trial didn't work out. Then I realized, wait a minute, that's a situation that's occurring more and more often. We can't ignore those situations. And despite the fact there was no yield response, there certainly was a response in terms of nitrous oxide emissions. So that's something we have to bear in mind. We did it again this last year. We had 2 sites, one in the west and one in the east. In the western site, again, even though the conditions were better, I think they got in a little bit late, but
September frost.
And in a September frost, again, no yield response. In the east, there was a bit of a yield response. We did see a yield response. So, I guess I'm suggesting, I'm wondering how we determine this concept of what is a realistic yield goal. Can we continue to fertilize for crops we may not be getting? And what is the cost of that, both economically and environmentally?
Can I ask a question?
Sure
Looking
can.
at the east and west there, do you have measurements within the trial on water supply to both?
I don't know if we measured water
No.
supply.
No, we could probably check with the grower to see if they had a rain gauge there.
Don't we have weekly moisture contents?
Soil
Yeah, we've measured soil moisture weekly.
Weekly?
So
The eastern field was planted about 2 weeks later than the western field as well.
Same variety?
Yeah.
So we're measuring these nitrous oxide emissions, which means the students are going into the field every 2 weeks? Every week, and we're measuring nitrous oxide flux, we're measuring also the nitrate concentration in the soil, we're measuring soil temperature, soil moisture. So we're going to be able to say, eventually we're going to be able to say a lot more about these sites and what the environmental condition was. And we're also going to comment on the agronomic constraints to production. I don't have the N2O flux values for these fields. We've measured them, but our lab's been down for 6 months, so we haven't been able to actually get the results yet.
No, I see that spike in the east, and I wonder if that part of the east had some rains that the west didn't have, or vice versa, and then how much impact does the soil type have on that as well? Like, I don't know, maybe I'm asking too many questions you can't answer.
Well, no, I can't, but I think, Steve, do you want to comment?
Well, I think the biggest difference between the 2 fields, Jason, was the 2 week or so shorter growing season in the east. At the time of late September, when that frost took out a lot of potatoes and PEI, the the field in the west was kind of settling down pretty good, where this eastern field is just starting to crank out tonnage, right? But the frost basically shut it down for the most part.
Do you think it could have even more than this then?
I think so.
This is the eastern one, is it?
Yeah, but if you look at the yields, I think the yields, flip back to the last slide there, Dave.
The yields in the other one were higher.
Yeah. So like say it's hard to speculate what the yields would have done in the east if they had been allowed to grow for another 3 weeks. We could have seen a big difference in the yields.
What about the general health of each field aside? Again, that's a very broad question, but it would seem to suggest that, to me, I don't know, rudimentary, like this is a stronger field in which there's obviously additional nitrogen that you can go at a lower rate and still have adequate to feed the crop to get your yield potential, whereas the other.
We've got some good, unfortunately, they're just digital camera pictures, but we've got some aerial pictures. We haven't got them yet to look at. And quite some time ago, you could pick out the 80 and the 235 rates. The 80, I'm talking standard units here, so 80 pounds versus 235. You could pick those out easy. You could throw the blanket over the rest of them, and stay like that right through basically when the crop died.
We didn't have any disease issues in either of these fields, did we?
No, nothing out of the ordinary
Nothing other.
that we noticed anyway.
It's just that this slide answers your question why growers want to put more nitrogen on.
No, I know.
The other slide feeds more into what you're talking about, in that in some fields, in some cases, they may not need to. But until we can figure out, keep going, I guess.
Yeah, no.
No, that's a valid comment, Jason, and that's part of what Dave's going to get to too, is field by field and being better able to peg on that field where you might have an opportunity to decrease and where maybe we need to put on what we're putting on.
The challenge with this, of course, and this is the challenge we've had in these last 2 years of these end response trials, is while I'm going to talk about some tools about measuring what's happening in the soil, I don't have a tool to predict next year's weather. And again, we were hit in 2 of our 3 trials here were hit by some sort of weather limitation that restricted the yield. And I thought, oh damn, just bad luck. But as I keep thinking about this data, I'm saying, how infrequent is this bad luck?
2 out of 3 would suggest not all that infrequent.
Well, exactly. And so is this something we need to start factoring into how we determine a realistic yield goal?
So thinking about yields, so like probably everybody in the room, I've been in numerous fields where the gross and marketable yields have been well above 500 bags the acre. And we haven't been putting on over 180, 190 pounds of N. So when Mother Nature gives you the goods, the amount of nitrogen we're using combined with what's in the soil provides the goods, right?
So it can be done.
Would it have been any better if we had 50 more pounds of N? I got no idea, because we didn't have 50 more pounds of N.
Right.
That's what I'm getting with in the other chart too, is it looks as though it obviously had adequate fertility to go at the low rate and still achieve the same yield. So it would suggest to me that it's a stronger
Yes.
field.
Yes.
With more residual nitrogen in the soil.
Nitrogen wasn't limited.
Whatever form.
Nitrogen wasn't limited.
Right.
Something else might have been. Might have been phosphorus, might have been potassium, might have been disease, might have been water, might have been.
We're only
But it
looking
wasn't
at-
nitrogen.
That's right.
And you can see that because the curve, your nitrous oxide curve on that, the first one, you know, the one before. So they all died at the same time. But the reason the nitrous oxide is the most on the ones with the highest rate is because there was all that nitrate left. That if that crop had been able to keep going and been able to make more crop, there would have been nitrate there to act on it, but because there was no crop,
To dig it
just
up.
got lost.
And this is one of the measurements that I'm not talking about today, but we are measuring the amount of nitrate that's persisting in the field. And we're finding that in these situations, we can use the amount of nitrate that's persisting as a way of saying, we've got more nitrogen than the crop needs. We're letting excess nitrate sit around. And that's the actual situation I think we want to try to manage. If the crop's taking it up, we want to provide it. But if the crop's not taking it up, we're wasting it. And so that's the kind of measure that I think we need to give you guys, so you can actually say, oh, wait a minute, I've got lots of nitrogen, it's something else. Or, no, nitrogen's what I need to be thinking about right now. And we need better site-specific tools to do that. That's what I want to talk about. So basically, one of the things that we're doing is we want to consider all the end sources, and we want to ask the question, what is the efficiency of nitrogen delivery, and how can we increase that efficiency? And that's really basically how do we minimize the amount of nitrogen that's sitting around available to be lost. And again, coming back to this point, are we, how certain are we that these are the right numbers? Okay, now I want to move on. So what I've talked about thus far is all based on table values. I'm not measuring very much. We're taking a number from this table, a number from that table, multiplying it by 0.9, subtracting 11. We're not doing a lot that says what's specific to your farm. So now I want to talk about some ways in which we can add some things that are a little bit more specific to your farm. So first of all, I've got to give you a little speech on soil organic matter because I'm a believer. I'm a believer, and I want you to be a believer. Maybe you already are, I hope you are. But we need to be thinking a whole lot more about soil organic matter because it does a whole bunch of things for us. One of the major things it does for us is it holds water. And so when we're dealing with climate stresses, droughts, too much water, soil organic matter can help us by storing more water. It also creates biodiversity. I'm a believer. I think the literature supports me. I don't know whether I can demonstrate that within the PEI context, but ultimately I believe the increased biodiversity of the soil will increase its disease suppressiveness. Not disease pressure, but the ability to suppress disease. It also enhances soil structure such that we can resist erosion. It's an important source of nutrients in terms of mineralization, but it's also an important source in terms of increased cation exchange capacity, which will hold more of that potassium, calcium, and magnesium against leaching. In our soils, we have such low permanent cation exchange capacity because we have such low clay content that a big percentage of our total cation exchange capacity is organic matter, and that's the portion of our cation exchange capacity we can actually manage by building up soil organic matter. It enhances root growth by making the structure less rigid, more friable, such that roots can push apart those aggregates and grow into that medium more effectively. And it's been shown to increase crop yield by generally increasing a variety of soil conditions. So that translates into better water storage, pathogen control, reduced erosion, increased fertility, increased water access, and increased profit. And these things are all interrelated. So I really think that building soil organic matter has to be a central focus. And it's one of the central focuses we're taking in terms of our soil health assessment, is trying to identify management practices that in potato production systems can build soil organic matter. What is soil organic matter? It's not simply buried crop residues. Burying crop residues doesn't make soil organic matter. What makes soil organic matter is allowing organic matter to decompose in an undisturbed condition, primarily plant roots. So one of our challenges in building soil organic matter is decreasing soil disturbance. We have to find ways within our crop rotation system where we can kind of leave the soil alone for a while. You go make some organic matter. We'll be back later. Okay, and I think that's a bit of a challenge in the potato production system. It's not impossible, but it's a challenge. So we know historically there's been, the provincial governments have done a wonderful job in developing a soil quality assessment database where over many years they've been looking at the characteristics of soils and PEI, and they've nicely documented the fact that organic matter is going down. We need to do something about it. It's reducing our water holding capacity, it's reducing our nutrient retention. There are some practices that we think can start building those soil organic matter, and we're trying to document that through the soil health program. So things like reduced soil disturbance, the use of cover crops, increased return of organic matter, growing crops with more extensive, finer root systems, and increasing perennial plant cover, pastures and that sort of thing. Obviously, for these kinds of practices to be of value to you, they have to fit into your rotational system. So we're looking for ways in which we can creatively implement these practices as part of a potato production system. And the potato board is interested in cover crops. And there's a number of you that are working on these things, and we want to work with you on it. It's an important consideration. If you go back to the worksheet, it says, oh, well, we can account for the mineralization of nitrogen. It's easy. What we do is, if you have more than 3.5% organic matter, add 15 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. If you've got less than 3.5 kilograms of nitrogen, add 0. We're done. Overly simplistic. How many here have soils that have more than 3.5% organic matter?
So,
Consistently, or the odd one?
The odd one, even. Not many, though.
Not many.
This also reflects that these numbers came from a time many years ago when this was not so uncommon. That highlights the problem, but also says this tool is not very effective at capturing the nitrogen supplying capacity of your soil, because it only applies to people that have more than 3.5%, and we're going to see that this number is way too low. One of the things we've been doing in Nova Scotia is we've been actually surveying a whole variety of cropping systems. We're doing some of the same work in PEI, we just don't have all the numbers available yet for that. And one of the things we're finding is the mineralization capacity, or here we've called it the biological end flush, is very much a function of cropping system. Much higher for forage and pasture systems because there's more continuous cover, there's less disturbance in those systems, there's more organic matter. If I put the plot up from organic matter, it would be almost exactly the same as this. Lower organic matter and high disturbance vegetable production systems, field crop systems. This cover crop one's a little bit worrisome. We don't know quite why that's so low. I think it might be the way those cover crops are being managed. But even compared to uncultivated land, we can actually increase organic matter based on the production system. So we think, I believe it's a very important consideration. Plus, I think it's all the more reason why we have to actually measure this. Right now, we're assuming the numbers are the same. Well, unless you have more than 3.5%. We're assuming it's 0 unless you have more than 3.5%. So I'm going to come back to the measurement piece in a second. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how this sheet talks about credits for plow down crops, for manures, and those sorts of things. So currently the fact sheet suggests here's how you can approach the issue of a plow down crop. Well, let's look at what kind of crop it is, how many years it's been in existence, what kind of stand it is, and here's the estimate that we can come out. So a good stand of alfalfa would release 80 kilograms of N per hectare, whereas a poor stand poor stand of anything releases virtually nothing. And a fair stand of a red clover second year, only 10 kilograms of N per hectare. Soybeans doesn't contribute very much. It's a legume, but almost all the nitrogen goes to the seed, so there's very little nitrogen left over. Annual ryegrass, not a legume, so it's not contributing any nitrogen. That's probably not exactly right, but certainly it tries to reflect the fact that if we've got a really good stand of a grass, it's actually going to have a lot of carbon, and when we incorporate that into the system, it's actually going to tie up nitrogen for a period of time, which could be a very good thing because it could reduce nitrogen losses, but it means that you have to think about the timing of that tie-up and nitrogen release in terms of your management.
So,
Dave, maybe you're going to mention it, but can you comment on how you manage those particular crops the year before, what impacts your food supply?
We'll talk a little bit about that. So I've got a couple slides. We'll give us something that'll talk a bit about that.
so is that a root system value, or is that an incorporated good stand value?
That's the whole thing incorporated, I think.
And how is it incorporated?
These are general values.
No, but as far as actually incorporating that heavy stand into the soil.
Physical practice in the field.
Physical practice.
Well, I expect what they're talking about is simply, this is a while ago, so this is probably plowed in the fall. Probably plowed in with a moldboard plow.
Any consideration to the timing with respect to how much of that's gonna leach, or?
There should be, there isn't, but there should be. So an early fall plow down is very different than a late fall plow down, different from a spring plow down. So those are excellent points. Those should be considerations. No. OMAF has a publication 611, which is a really useful resource. It's a free downloadable PDF. I recommend you download it if you haven't already. And they talk a little bit about plow down management as well. So they talk basically about the legume content of the forage, whether it's mostly grass or mostly legume. And they give it values, mostly grass 0, mostly legume 50% or more, up to 110 kilograms of N per hectare. They also talked about some perennial legumes and seeded and plowed in the same year, values for those, and then soybean and bean residues. They also talk a little bit about the timing of the release of that material for various, in terms of the period of maximum demand for various crops. Now, they don't have potatoes on here, but potatoes are probably closer to pumpkins than they are corn. They're in the later part of the year. Well, maybe not far long after corn. But one of the things that's important is how the nature of the crop and how it was managed influenced the rate at which the nitrogen is released. So I'm putting this up more as to convey a concept than to convey these precise numbers. But for example, if we looked at a fall-killed red clover crop, a spring-killed red clover crop, because the fall crop has had more time to mineralize and decompose, it releases the nitrogen more rapidly, or earlier in the following season than does the spring incorporated crop. In previous sessions said, well, what about if you burn it versus plow it down? Don't know, but should know. Okay, I think that is an important consideration. I think one of the challenges with either early fall plowing or burning down a crop early in the fall is there's an opportunity for mineralization to occur and nitrification and nitrate to accumulate. In our climate, any nitrate that accumulates in the fall is gone by the next spring. It's just gone. It's lost. Don't know whether it's denitrified or leached or both, but it's not going to be in the field in the spring. So one of the things we want to look at is, are there ways in which we can tie up that nitrogen? So one strategy is plow it down early in the fall, but plant a cover crop that's going to capture that nitrogen and bring it over into the next year. Another one is delay the killing of that crop until the temperature gets cold, because the organisms that cause the conversion of ammonium to nitrate, the nitrifiers, don't like the cold. They don't do well in cool temperatures and cool soils. So they won't convert it to nitrate, it'll stay as ammonium, and ammonium is less leachable than is nitrate.
But
So there's
too
more.
late for a cover crop then too, so.
What's that?
Too late for a cover crop when it comes
It's too late, but if we've limited the amount of nitrate that's formed, there's less need for a cover crop, at least for the residue nitrogen.
Not for erosion though, or windy erosion.
No, there's lots of other reasons why we need a cover crop. So in many respects, maybe the early killing and plowing in followed by the cover crop is the more sustainable approach. I guess. Killing the crop and leaving it on the soil surface. Part of the problem there is that if you apply Roundup, a lot of the nitrogen-rich compounds are going to leach out of the material and leach into the soil. And particularly if it's done early and there is no cover crop, they're probably going to nitrify to nitrate and they'll be lost.
What do you mean by early? What soil temperatures?
I think they use 5 degrees. Once
degrees.
the soil goes down below 5 degrees is when we're starting to get inhibition of nitrification. There's some debate about that. Some say 10. I think 10 is too high. 5's probably more right. Once you're getting sort of soil temperatures staying around. So that we're talking November.
Yeah. which you're gonna have reduced efficacy of glyphosate anyways.
Yep. So, anyway, so, that's what I was gonna say about credits for plowed out. I think that's kind of the state of knowledge. I don't know whether we have a lot more on that. And I think that's something we need to have more information.
I got a question.
Okay?
So you grow sorghum Sudan grass and you mulch it 3 times a year. Are you getting any value out of that mulch, or is it all just developing a heavier root system when you're leaving it laying on the ground?
So mulch it, you mean you're like crimping it, or?
Mulching it and just, yeah, shredding it and letting it regrow.
I think you, so what, okay, how do I answer this? So yes, I think you're stimulating the root system, and root system makes more organic matter. The other thing that we found is that the organic matter increases in no-till systems because you're not disturbing them as much, but you're building up that thatch. And that thatch actually gives another opportunity to form organic matter.
Did you say thatch?
Thatch,
Okay.
like the residue on the
Residue,
surface.
yeah, okay.
Because it doesn't completely decompose.
Yeah.
A lot of it decomposes, it doesn't completely decompose. And it turns brown. And the brown residues are higher C/N ratio residues where we have more lignin and more potential to form organic matter because there's less disturbance of them as well. So I guess my guess would be that's probably not an unreasonable system to build up soil organic matter, especially if you're not tilling them in. I showed you an early one about cover crops in vegetable production systems in Nova Scotia. I think part of the problem with that cover crop system is I think that system gets a lot of tillage. And so while we may be building some organic matter with the cover crop, we're getting rid of it with the tillage.
Dave?
Yes?
Let's say you're grounding up a forage crop, early fall plow down, and you're putting oats, barley on afterwards. How much nitrogen do you think is actually going to be taken up? And will it last until the next spring in comparison to like winter cereal?
I expect, I don't know, in terms of amount of nitrogen taken up, I've seen lots of numbers from warmer climates where it says it's a lot. I think a lot of it depends on how cold the fall is, but it's probably 20, 30 kilograms then per hectare domestically.
Is it a few inches?
Well, again, it also depends on how much crop it is, right? How much. If you're only getting a few plants here and there, it's not going to take up very much. But if you're getting a relatively good stand establishment and has a month to grow, then it probably takes up a fair amount. And I think that most of that would be carried over to the next spring. But if you only have a very poor stand and only a few weeks of growth, then it's not going to take up very much. I'm not going to talk very much about manure other than to say there is a series of equations in this sheet that talks about the manure. And there's 2 elements of the manure you have to think about. One is the ammonium content of the manure, and the other is the organic nitrogen, and they're very different. The ammonium content, the other important aspect is I recommend you get your manure tested. Base it on an actual manure test. Don't use table values. Even though in the nutrient management course we use table values. We shouldn't. We stopped doing it. We should actually be testing this stuff because every manure is different. It just is. So get your manure tested. Use those test values, and in this case, in terms of the ammonium content of the manure, we need to consider the ammonium content, but we also need to consider the potential for loss. If we have a liquid hog manure and we leave it on the surface for 3 or 4 days, we've lost a lot of ammonium. If we inject it, we've lost almost none. It's a big difference. The ammonium is immediately available for plant uptake, so it's essentially the same as nitrogen fertilizer. The ammonium content. We talk about the organic matter content. It's a bit more challenging. It has to be mineralized first. It isn't necessarily done. That doesn't necessarily happen quickly, and therefore time has to. All of it gets mineralized, and the C/N ratio of the manure is a very strong determinant of how much gets mineralized. So here in this equation, we're calculating the organic N content of the manure by subtracting the ammonium from the total, and then we use this availability coefficient that is dependent on the time of application, and the C to N ratio. The narrower the C to N ratio, the more rapidly it's going to become available. The wider the C to N ratio, the more nitrogen it's going to tie up in the short term. So in a fall application, the fact that we have a wide C to N ratio is probably a good thing because it's going to tie it up for a period of time and not mineralize it when we don't want it. Questions about that? That's my manure piece.
Applying it to like the sorghum case that was just mentioned, that would help your C to N ratio, wouldn't it?
So if you're applying manure during the
Onto
season,
that residue,
yes, that would very much. So
because you're gonna get more carbon.
whenever you can add carbon with nitrogen, when you're not wanting the nitrogen to be immediately available, potato crop is a good thing because you're going to tie it up, make organic matter hold it. So carbon and nitrogen go well together unless you need a lot of plant available nitrogen, like in the potato crop. So it's as you get closer to the potato crop that you need to worry a little bit more about the C to N ratio and whether you have enough carbon to actually immobilize nitrogen. And I would argue that in the potato crop you still have a window of opportunity in that the maximum period of nitrogen uptake doesn't occur in the first part of the season. It's a little later on in the season.
It's gonna be the
July,
year-
Steve?
Pardon me?
When's the maximum nitrogen uptake for potato? July?
Well, it's wrap it up to full row closure, and then it kind of levels off a bit, but it's.
When does the rapid part start, though? I would say sometime in July, probably. I mean, when they're not doing much when they're this big. You got to get some size on them before they're taking too much nitrogen.
Mostly gonna be in the rotational crop years anyways.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think very many people. No one-
You can't
Yeah.
apply, so.
So not to drag out the manure thing, but to spread it on the sorghum is basically you're leaving it exposed to the air, and is it not gonna be a lot of it lost as well?
You can inject it. You hurt the
Not
crop.
not the type of manures we're using.
That's true.
Not dry manure.
That's true. There's no liquid hog manure anymore. in
But like
the
liquid
guys.
dairy would work with sorghum.
Yeah.
That'd help.
If you could inject it, yeah.
Even if you can leave it on top, it's still better than the alternative.
Yeah, maybe.
So actually, yeah, that's a good point, is that, so not incorporated in crop residues, if you're putting it in midsummer, they're assuming you're losing 50% of the ammonium. In the fall, 40%. Or in the fall, they're assuming 60% is lost. So everything I've talked about now has been basically about these table values, optimizing them a little bit for the fact that we know your soil organic matter content, but not really saying anything specific about your farm. And this is where we thought this is inappropriate. We want to talk about actual measures that occur, could be used on your farm. And so we developed this soil nitrogen test concept. And so what we do, we want to make this test as practical as possible. So for example, in Western Canada, they would go measure nitrate in the fall because the nature of their winters are such that almost all that nitrate's available the next spring. So that's convenient. You can go out and do the measurement, get the lab results back, plan for next spring, in the middle of February, all wonderful. In Ontario, they can't do that, but they use this pre-sidrous nitrogen test. So they can wait long enough in terms of their corn production system that they can get a test that reasonably estimates the mineralization in the early part of the growing season, and they use that as an index of how much mineralization they think is going to occur over the rest of the season. We don't really kind of have that luxury in Prince Edward Island. And we don't have a recommended nitrogen soil test. So we thought that's a problem. We want to see whether we can correct that. The thing we know is that most of the inorganic nitrogen is lost over winter, and most of the nitrogen that's going to be supplied by the soil to the crop is a result of mineralization over the growing season. So it's mostly biological. So we wanted to develop a test that measures the biological and supplying capacity of the soil in a practical way. So what we did is we designed a test where we sample the soil in the fall and air dry that sample. That stops everything. So now we can, at our leisure, ship it to the lab. The lab can process it at their leisure, and we can get a result back in time for the following crop season. To me, that's a practical solution, rather than trying to get it on a Greyhound bus and get it there within 2 days and get it analyzed and try all that turnaround. We're just not equipped for that. So we take this air dry soil, we leach it with calcium dilute salt solution. to get all the mineral in and out. And then we incubate it for 2 weeks aerobically, and then leach it again to see how much nitrogen's been produced. I personally don't believe that particular test is as important, because there's other tests out there. But what's important is they have to be measuring the biological potential of the soil. Some of the tests that are out there are just simple chemical extractions. I don't think those tests will work very well, but there are other tests that could be done. But this is the one we chose, and so we've been doing a lot of evaluation of that, and we think it works reasonably well. The PEI Soil Test Lab is considering doing it. They're doing a pilot study on it, see whether that's what test they'll offer as a service. But one of the things we wanted to ask is there enough variation from field to field to be bothered with? We're assuming all the fields in PEI have the same mineralization potential. Well, maybe that's right. Or maybe it's only 10% variation, so why bother? Well, we're not looking for work. So we did a trial in 2014 with the PEI Potato Board, and a lot of you guys were involved in that trial, where we took 26 farms from across the island, and we took a sample, 4 samples from each of their fields, in the fall of 2014, in the spring of 2015, and then we sampled nitrate profile in the fall of 2015. So we sampled fields that were in fall of 2014 that were going into potatoes the next year. You guys grew a crop of potatoes. We have your nitrogen application rates, we have your yield, and we have the residual nitrate left in the soil. We thought this would be a good way of assessing, is there variability in nitrogen supplying capacity of soils in Prince Edward Island? This is what we came up with. The blue bar is what we measured in the fall and the variability of the 4 samples within a field. The red bar is what we measured in the spring in the same field across the 26 sites. In assessing the potential of this as a soil test, one of the things we're looking for is how big are these bars relative to the overall variation. And we found that 16%, there was only 16% variation within a field. That's pretty damn good. Saying this test, there's 4 samples we collected from the field, were giving us a pretty consistent measure of the nitrogen supplying capacity of that field. However, there was 53% variation in between fields. So that's saying there is significant variation between fields, such that it's something we might want to measure. And they all looked pretty reasonably consistent from spring to fall. There was actually a bit of an increase in the average value from fall to spring, which suggests the biological potential increases over the winter period, which kind of makes sense. We have one outlier, and when I phoned up Ryan to find out what that was all about, it turned out that producer had added manure to that field after we had tested it in the fall. But in the spring, we did actually pick up the increased biological potential of that added manure. So that actually ended up giving us a bit more confidence in the test.
So what would be the reason for the variation between fields, like different?
Between fields?
Organic matter or
Yeah.
different?
The primary reason is differences in organic matter. We wanted to say, okay, we've measured this biological nitrogen potential. How much of that potential is realized? Many of the attempts to do this in other areas have failed because they haven't considered the climatic constraints on nitrogen mineralization that occur within that system. So we actually took typical climate data for PEI, 40-year normal data, to try to say how much nitrogen mineralization would occur in these soils over a 130-day growing period. And this is what we came up with for the 26 sites. On average, about 65 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. This scale, unfortunately, is in milligrams then per kilogram, but multiplied by 2 to get kilograms per hectare. So we had a range of something like 30 to something like 120. So based on this measurement, we're assessing, we're saying that there's a range in nitrogen mineralization in these 26 farms from 30 kilograms of N over the growing season to 120. And I think that's an important consideration in determining right rate of nitrogen application. It's also, I think, an important thing for assessing soil health. How are we doing? This one's sort of something's happening there. It says we need to look at enhancing the biological activity of the organic matter content of that soil. Here we've got some that are doing a little bit better. We're doing, you know, we can make progress. We can track our progress because we're measuring stuff about our fields. Earlier I said if I have 3.5% organic matter, I should give it a credit of 15 kilograms of N per hectare. This is suggesting that actually that number should be more like 85 kilograms of N per hectare for that much organic matter. But the other interesting thing is that we went to all this trouble of doing the soil N test, but we can get pretty close to that number by just measuring organic matter content. So maybe we should just do a better job of measuring organic matter content, particularly total nitrogen content of the soil, and use that as a predictive tool. It won't give us as good a value as the N test, but it would give us a whole lot better than the 0 that we're currently using. And we're piloting that with the soil test lab too, see whether they're able to do that measurement. This is important also because if we look at the distribution of where these higher mineralization potentials are, in this part of the province, we're seeing the blue is the higher, and also corresponds to where we're seeing some of the higher nitrate loadings to groundwater. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I want to talk now about reducing the environmental impact, particularly some of the post-harvest tests. So we did this little balance and we said that, oh, we might be leaving some nitrogen behind. Why don't we use that as a measure indicator of how well we're doing? So I want to talk a little bit about yield, but mostly about residual soil nitrogen, the measurement of residual soil nitrogen. Agriculture Canada constructs a series of agri-environmental indicators that are meant to evaluate the potential for environmental impact of agriculture in Canada. One of them is the risk of water contamination by nitrogen. And the primary indicator they use to assess the risk of water contamination by nitrogen is a calculated residual soil nitrogen value. They calculate that by taking the number of units of nitrogen that are input into the system and subtracting the nitrogen removal in the crop. So just input-output, like our very simple, my very first calculation we did for the potato system. That's their basis of the residual soil nitrogen calculation. In Western Canada, they have almost no residual soil nitrogen, inputs minus outputs. They haven't considered soil nitrogen mineralization. These are black chernozemic soils. They're mineralizing a crap load of nitrogen. So that's not considered. So that's one of the reasons why they can get that balance so tight, is because they've got a huge supply of nitrogen that they can rely upon coming from their soils. In Eastern Canada, lots of red, saying that we have more than 40 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare left in our soils after the harvest of the crop. PEI in particular, if we look at the trend over the last 30 years, in 1981 we had mostly low and moderate, and over time we get up to the situation where it's mostly very high, and we backed off that from a little bit. And what's driving that is really the amount of nitrogen being added in the production system. Again, this is for province as a whole. These are Stats Canada calculated numbers. These are not measurements. These are based on statistical reporting. So we have an input, our output, and the difference peaked in 2000, 2006, or 2001, 2006, and is down a little bit. Somewhere around 40 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. What did we find on our 26 farms? A whole lot more than 40 kilograms of nitrogen in many cases. In some cases as much as 300. Typically more like 50, 60. Okay, so we are leaving a fair amount of residual soil nitrogen in our soils as part of our production systems. Those numbers are higher in the central regions than they are in the eastern or the western. Interestingly, residual soil nitrogen was not related to nitrogen fertilizer application rate. No relationship at all. In fact, if anything, a little bit negative, but that's no relationship. What it was related to was nitrogen mineralization potential. So one of the reasons why we're leaving more residual nitrogen in some of those farms than others is we're not measuring and accounting for that nitrogen mineralization potential. The other factor that explained some of the residual soil nitrogen was plant yield. Where we had very poor yields for probably some disease or climatic or other reason, we didn't take up as much nitrogen, we left more in the field. That's understandable, that's hard to control. This is easier to control, or at least easier to measure and account for. And I think this is one of my arguments as to why we should be measuring this. Is if we are being asked, and we will eventually be asked, to reduce nitrogen impacts, residual soil nitrogen is probably one of the ways we're going to be assessing that. And so this is one of the ways we can actually reduce residual soil nitrogen levels in our soils. Comments on that?
So we build the ability to get more nitrogen out of the soil. How do we maintain or control the leaching issue?
So that nitrogen is being made available anyway. It's whether we're using it or not. So by not accounting for it, we're adding nitrogen that we didn't have to, and not taking advantage that we're already given this nitrogen for free. Well, for free by our good soil management. So we're maintaining the soil organic matter by our rotational systems, by our legume management, manure management, those sorts of things. That's what's keeping the organic matter level high, and it's paying us a premium. But we're just not accounting for that premium when we determine chemical fertilizer application. That's the way I kind of look at it. So
how do we get to the point where you can test our fields and economically, safely suggest to us that we can drop from 200 or 210 down to 180 units a bin and have no negative economic impact on your Burbank crop or whatever crop?
So we have to show that to you. So I've alluded to the fact that we've sent a proposal into Fertilizer Canada, where what we're proposing to do is on 6 farms across Prince Edward Island do a nitrogen responsive trial like the 3 that I showed you earlier. Where what we do is go out and grow our landscapes, adjust top dress such that we could have 3 nitrogen application rates, 1 treatment where we've based the nitrogen application rate on the soil test value, accounting for the end mineralization potential, and 1 where we've included an enhanced efficiency fertilizer. So a total of 5 treatments, replicated, I think we said 6 times or 8 times, I don't know how many times, replicated anyway, such that we can actually show that data to you and say, see, by basing it on the soil nitrogen test, you can get the same yield at a lower cost. Or by using an enhanced efficiency fertilizer, you can get the same yield at a lower cost, or the same cost. That's the way I think we can demonstrate to you that this could be relied upon. The next step, of course, is we need to have a mechanism by which you can do that soil testing. So if it turns out we still do need this aerobic incubation, we'll have to assess whether the soil test lab can do it, at what cost, is that practical? Now that we see this fairly tight correlation with organic matter, an even tighter one with total nitrogen, we may actually just say to the soil test lab, and we've talked to them a little bit about this, turn on your nitrogen indicator so when you measure total carbon, you also get total nitrogen. And that's a way in which, for the same cost, for the same sample, you could be getting an estimate of nitrogen mineralization on all the samples you currently submit to the soil test lab, which I hope is a lot.
And you'll test for, the key to getting buy-in at this side of the table is showing us what the pay weight was in 1 or 2 of the markets, the main markets that we're in. So
Okay.
whether it's processing or table,
Okay.
on every one of your tests. Not just gross yield, right? Because I've seen gross yields at 380 and a pay weight of 250 or less in the same, exact same field, because quality was off, whether it's smalls or crooked or, you know what I mean? There's been all kinds, people have seen all kinds of extremes. And if you show me a 400 hundredweight, I might have a 310 hundredweight that'll pay yield that 400 hundredweight gross.
No, and that's a good point, and that's something I think we are measuring that. I think for the M response trials I did show marketable weight. I didn't
Yeah,
show
those numbers you showed are all graded Canada #1 standards. They're not pushed through central grading, but they're all graded and the #1 processing grade, which gravity's done on them. We're not frying them.
No, that's.
They're measured for misshapes and roughs and knobs and stuff, so they.
But I want to hear that, because I think I'm wasting my time if I'm developing something you guys aren't interested in adopting. So I need to find the cost, the package that's going to convince you that you can rely upon this, so you'll use it and adopt it. Because I think it will make you more economic, and it will also reduce your environmental impact. I think that's important. But it needs to be in a way, developed in a way in which it's usable, and it's useful, and it's economic. And perhaps it turns out that soil testing costs too much that it doesn't become practical. Well, then we can start working on the policy side to see whether we can get the costs reduced. Because there is provincial buy-in to the fact that we have to reduce these environmental impacts. And some of that cost has to be shared. So there's also ways in which we can make it more economic if economics is the problem. And also, quite frankly, I think the supply side is soon going to be asking for this anyway. Many other crops, the corn producers are now being told, this is what you shall do if you're going to sell to Walmart. And Walmart's not paying for it. They're just saying, do this and so, or else we're not going to buy your stuff. And I don't think we're there yet with potatoes, but I'm not so sure that's so far away. I don't know.
But at a rudimentary level for now, there's a pretty strong correlation between organic matter and mineralization. So even if you go back to the first table that has those rough numbers, that if you want to use plus or minus 10%, wherever you fall on that scale, you can still apply that.
We can start. Yeah, we can start that.
today.
We can start that. Yeah.
So,
And that's
if the other system that you're talking about isn't viable from a cost perspective, then I can't speak on behalf of all the growers, but as a grower, I'd rather see at least, if that correlation can be strengthened and reliably strengthened, which it looks like it already is statistically, that would be an easy, maybe a more digestible approach for a lot of growers.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think so. And I think we're close to that. The other principle that we talked about in this proposal that we've since removed, but we're thinking about exploring in terms of in terms of our living lab discussion is, I've become a firm believer that the best information to inform your practices is information collected from your farm. So I'm really interested in exploring, is there a practical way in which we can get you to do a calibration on your farm? And so one of the things we've been thinking about is a way in which we can get you to do a test strip where you do 80% of your normal nitrogen fertilizer application for just a test strip every year, and see, did it make a difference? And that's a way in which you can do a self-calibration. So you know what? I've been doing that test strip for 3 years, never seen a decrease in yield. Maybe I can cut back to that. And then when you cut back, maybe you still include an 80% of that. And that way you can find your right, or maybe you're going to say, you do your 80% strip and that was crap. So now I know, now I can document that I'm actually the better pay. I've shown that if I cut back, I'm going to pay. Okay? And that doesn't deal with the issue of weather variability. I don't know how to deal with that one yet. But if that at least says under sort of constant normal conditions, we can actually calibrate each individual farm and ensure that you are indeed using the right rate. It's just we're trying to work out the logistics of how that could be done practically. One of the things that was suggested in an earlier session is maybe we just do it by adjusting top dress. So all your pre-plant, your down the pipe stuff is all, and then you just play around a bit with the top dress.
There would have to be some consideration to the rotation on all of these farms when you go to reduce, as to what the results are going to be. If you've got reasonable organic matter and versus and a good rotation versus maybe a 2-year rotation, there's going to be different results. Would that be a fair statement?
It's an interesting hypothesis. I'd like to test it. Does that organic matter tell the full story, or do we need more about the quality of the organic matter, the quality of the rotation? I don't know. I didn't expect to see that strong correlation with organic matter. I originally said, no, organic matter is not enough. The quality of the organic matter is really important. We can't just use organic matter. We went to all this bother, And then we do correlation of organic matters telling, the most significant correlation. But maybe.
And not to get in, but the speed of mineralization correlates along with soil moisture, like,
Yeah, so when this function is really soil moisture and soil temperature. So what we do is we take climate data and we do what in soil science we call a pedotransfer function. So based on air temperature and rainfall, we estimate soil temperature and soil moisture. And we do that on a daily time step to take this potential and say how much of that potential is realized. And we've done some correlations nationally and within the region that shows that our function's pretty good at doing that. It's a pretty good predictor. So that's how we get the 130-day mineralization. Right? So we try to digest that for you by giving you these numbers rather than just a parts per million of some nitrogen mineralization potential that you can't interpret. This is a bit more practical because we think this is pretty close to the actual amount of nitrogen that would be mineralized over the growing season in that soil. We have to demonstrate that, but we're feeling pretty confident about that.
the timing of the mineralization available for the potato crop the next year could be compromised by a slowdown of, you might miss the target, I guess.
One of the reasons why we're measuring this is something that we measure on a weekly basis, the nitrate concentration of the soil. Originally we did it with soil tests, now we're doing ion exchange membranes, where we measure the nitrate supply to a probe and change the probes every 2 weeks. And that measures the amount of nitrate that persists in the soil over the growing season. What we're trying to do is we're trying to develop nitrogen delivery strategies that minimize that nitrate, keep it above a certain level so there's enough for the plant, but ensure that not too much accumulates, because if too much accumulates, we get more N2O emissions, get more potential for nitrate leaching. So the real goal is to try to optimize the system such that we're supplying the plant, but we're not letting lay-ball stuff accumulate. And that part of that is understanding the time course of nitrogen mineralization. And part of it is also having fertilizer sources that also account for that synchrony, which is, I'm getting ahead of myself. I've got to go back because I'm supposed to be talking about 4 hours now.
We want to take like a 5-10 minute break.
Sure.
Washroom, get up, stretch, coffee, water.